Hello, 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 hello. I am Grandmaster Dennis Boros, and you are watching the Chat Sweep channel. Hello, everyone in the chat. Let me even name you, people. To see you all. Hello, early risers. That was Scratchin' Magician, Vornaki, me, and Angelou de Soar, and everybody else. Hello there. Now, this time, we are going to have something different from the usual. This time, we are going to have sort of a lecture phase, at least in this part, and it's going to focus on Benoni classics. So, before we start, I am curious. If you hear the word Benoni, who is the first person that comes to mind? While I set up. Yeah, good. Fisher says Scratchin' Magician. Good start. There are actually some very, very good and old Russian / Soviet players who are amazing at the Benoni. But one of the clear favorites of it all is Bobby Fischer, of course. Who else that comes to mind? Indeed, it's the Benoni. This is going to be a Benoni stream. Hello, Midafanta. How's it going? Tal was also a big Benoni, more of like this old Benoni type of player. Maybe Tal too, yes. Hello there, Atansaya. So one of the first ones was, I think, Polugayevsky. He was someone who you might not be that familiar with, but he was an avid Benoni player. But of course, if we're starting with some classics, obviously it has to be a Fischer game. So, with that, we're going to start with one that was played against Gligorich. Yes, we are very familiar with the Fischer Spassky game. What was the key move there? If you're in testing mood, I'm ready to ask you this question. What was the big move? Hello, Todd TDM. So I accept any questions, mostly related to the Benoni. Yeah, the knight h5 move. Good luck, have fun, GG. Yes, exactly. Now, but this time I'm gonna give you something that you wouldn't expect to happen. So this game is between Gligorich and Fischer. Gligorich, Fischer. Actually, I'm wrong. Gligorich Fischer will be the next one, which will be a fascinating idea. But first, let's start with a little bit of a teaser, because this one's good. Behnam Falanezad, thank you for following. So let's start with that one. So, without further ado, let's head over to the studies, my studies, and Fischer's classic. So d4, this is a d4 opening, it's well known. This is chapter 1, it's Fischer's classic. Knight f6, c4. So, if we want to play the Benoni, how should we start? Obviously, any way you do it, it'll have its benefits and its downsides. So I see by scratching Magician c5. It's pretty effective, but that's not the only way to play it. So both e6 and c5 is a way of playing it, or c5 immediately. Now Fischer played c5. You can do it with e6, but on the other hand, then white can go knight c3, and it could be a little bit dubious in some ways. In fact, the reason this move order is not loved that much because there is this f4 e5 line, which deemed fairly risky by theory. So they started to avoid this constellation, this way of playing. But anyways, played c5, e6. Yeah, so the point when they play with e6 that they're waiting for white to play knight f3, c5, d5, takes. And now you no longer have the e4, f4 idea because the knight is already on f3. That is the little tweaks, grandmaster tweaks, that Benoni players are fond of, and they know that it's beneficial of knowing them. Anyways, Fischer played c5, so we put this game in the right time frame. This is in the 1970s, interzonal, and he's facing the famous grandmaster Wolfgang Ullmann. Ullmann was a very strong player. In fact, he defeated Fischer in previous encounters. And he guesses what opening he faced. Fischer was white, by the way. Hey there, none of your business. So actually, Ullmann did defeat Fischer previously, with the black color, mind you. Yes, it was the French defense. d5, e6. So Ullmann is not a slouch. He's pretty good. He takes d5. And in fact, yeah, e takes d5 is good here. Takes d6, e4, g6. Now, Ullmann doesn't play the f4, e5 system. That became dangerous later on in history. But we're still early, and this is still the infancy of the Benoni. It's still the 1970s, mind you. So bishop f4, and now we have to be very careful. In the Benoni, those who are big experts or people who are new to this system, what do you have to look out for when you play this system? Any guesses or ideas? First thoughts, first impressions? Definitely the d6 pawn. What else? Yeah, as Gretchen Magician points out, knight b5 could eventually be a problem. Now we do have knight e4s, but this combination can be very powerful, as sooner or later we'll have to play bishop g7 anyways. If that is clear, how can black avoid all of the trouble? a6, yes. The point of a6 is double fold. So first off, you stop any knight b5 ideas, as that could be a threat. Queen a4 is no longer that annoying because you just block it, and your bishop is still defending this pawn. Don't forget that. And what else is a6 useful for? So it's actually not just a defensive move, but something that you want to know because it's, as Arsenal fan Richie points out, it's preparing b5. And if you get b5, your situation improves a little bit. A lot? I wouldn't go that far, but the situation would get a little better. a6. So this always gets the knee-jerk reaction a4, stopping b5. Bishop g7, and now you see the point of this early a6. Knight b5 is no longer possible, and you can't put pressure on this pawn. And this long maneuver, although possible, but it takes too much time. And black does have enough defenses there. So, knight f3, castle, bishop e2. And here, something is fishy with white's play. It looks fairly normal, but the reality is Ullmann's play been a little bit imprecise. Why is white's play a little bit, just a little bit suspicious? Considering there are better ways of playing against the Benoni. Any move suggestions? The chat. Deepsitan and Arsenal fan Richie is right on the money. So we have bishop g4. And that is why oftentimes in a different system, let's say here, they play h3 just to circumvent any bishop g4 ideas. So here Ullmann, as not that familiar here with the system, allows bishop g4. And this is something that's important to remember in these type of positions. Black is just super happy to part with that bishop because oftentimes this bishop is stranded on c8 and does nothing at all. So you'd be happy to exchange it for anything, a bishop, a knight, whatever, if you just want to get rid of it. So both knight d2, oh, no, both knight d2 and h3 makes a lot of sense. You just want to exchange it off. And even though, let's say this position, black achieved something White still does have more space and the bishop pair. Kutuzov, thank you for subscribing with Twitch Prime. So even though black would achieve something, this is still a decent position for white. Peter Pleaser, thank you for following. Roman Castle. The Hayward of Time. Thank you for following. So there was castling coming on here. Now we play a rook e8, immediately attacking on e4. h3. And let's see. Hello there, Fintel. We're just wondering what should we do now. So we played bishop g4 with the idea of taking on f3. Should we do it? Should we take on f3? You wouldn't? Bishop h5 would be a piece sacrifice, and not a good one at that. So chat, what would you do? Would you take on f3? What moves would you consider here? So I see knight h5 as an alternative. I see some consider there. We actually brought the bishop on g4 for a particular reason, Fintel. We want to exchange it off. So we have this suggestion, this suggestion. Well, Fischer did a third option. Black to move and win. And obviously, the third move is easy to find. The question is, what's the point behind it? So, okay, knight takes e4, but what if I take your bishop? Yeah, Fischer said, has it all done. Knight takes e4. So this is how grandmasters think. So first off, Fischer plays bishop g4. Okay, I want to exchange off this terrible bishop for anything. Fine. Now I don't have to take anything yet, so I'll play rook e8, attack on e4. Was Fischer thinking about sacrificing on e4 immediately here? No, he wasn't. But his opponent played h3 and said, I want to take on f3. Might even consider knight h5, but that probably runs into bishop g5. And he says, whoa, what if I take on e4? Would that work? Alkaline, thank you for subscribing with a tier 1. Subscribe for 3 months. Welcome back. Long time no see, indeed. So he says, oh, knight e4. So if h takes g4, then indeed, as Fischer says, bishop takes c3, which is a big move. Oftentimes, you don't want to give away your dark squared bishop. But here, this is working like a charm. Well, for one thing, it double attacks the queen and the bishop. But there's a third reason why this is so good. What is this third reason why this bishop takes c3 is so good here for Fischer? The Benoni is played time to time, so I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with it yet. It is just an opening Sometimes it is a little bit passive, but it is playable. So the point of this is not the fact that you can take on e2, but for the reason that you have a fork after that one, and you get rid of an exchange of that dangerous bishop on f4. A lot of the times, white would even sacrifice an exchange just to get this black squared bishop. Here though, Fischer could take on f4 and would be just a pawn up. So that is kind of the reason why this position is just so great. So h takes g4 didn't come on the board. So knight takes e4 happened. But we still have to continue because this piece is still hanging and our opponent just took a piece on e4. Wonder how to continue. Rook takes e4. The point is to attack this bishop. But wait, what if I place bishop g5 attacking the queen? That lady will be in danger. And if queen e8, white might play bishop d3 attacking this rook. So there is some calculation going on here. What's going on here? Well, you can't quite take on e2 because there's a knight blocking that. I didn't play. I did not play. We're actually still focusing on the Benoni. Yep, so bishop g5. So again, double trouble. We've got to find another way. So sometimes you can't defend both of your things. But there's one way of defending your stuff, and that is counterattacking. So we see queen e8. What's the point of queen e8, dear chat? Let me know what is the idea. Now some of you are mentioning f6, which is a viable option, but what do we say about f3s and f6? Especially with the bishop on g7, that's a very dodgy move. Yep, so queen e8 hits this bishop on e2. The point is, if they take, we can take on e2, and the material count is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. According to my high-level math, that is an extra pawn. So von Hoffman, you're saying f6. So f6 is a move that is not desirable. And probably this is kind of a difference between ranks in the chess world. A grandmaster would think about f6 just as you do, but say, on principle, f6 is wrong. Yet you keep on holding to the idea of f6. The grandmaster would think about f6 and say, no, if I have anything better, which would not ruin my king's safety and wouldn't close my bishop, I would try to find that one. So they would think about this move, but would decide against it at the end. I hope that does answer some questions. So queen e8, the point with this move is to keep this bishop open. and also threaten this bishop on e2. Now happens that Ullman does have this little twist of bishop d3 and another double attack. And bishop takes f3. So not only that did Fischer achieve his goal so far of getting rid of this bishop, he also netted an extra pawn. Queen f3, but it's not over. Because what does white have that black does not have at all? And this is very important. And I do understand we look from the winner's perspective, but let's be objective for a second and understand what's going for white here. Better development, exactly, Paragon. So Ullman is ready to deploy his rooks immediately. And also, as mentioned in the chat, the bishop pair is just monstrous. And also a good point is that there's two more pieces left in the garage for Mr. Bobby Fischer. Now, our goal is to survive before Ullman could attack us. Let's try to find some very nice stabilizing moves for Fischer. Now don't forget, Ullman was constantly harassing our pieces. So you wouldn't be wrong thinking that there are pieces that are still endangered. So I see rook e5 and rook b4 mentioned. e5 and rook b4 mentioned. So can anyone tell me, also rook takes a4. Can anyone tell me why would you play rook b4 or rook e5? And I'm awaiting your thoughts. Go. So Fischer says has to be played, rook b4 that is, even though it is dangerous. Okay, fair enough. Rook e5 gains a tempo, says von Hoffman. But, okay, I understand you win a tempo. But what if I attack your rook again? Did you win a tempo in that case? As Arsenal fan Richie points out correctly, if you go here, you do win the tempo, but the bishop will attack you again, actually attacking the rook. Once it moves, this will become a big target. So it's not a clean win. It is not necessarily bad, but it's definitely not a clean win. Meaning, it's not cleanly the best. So in fact, Fischer decided to play rook b4. Why not rook takes a4? Well, because then this queen would be tangled to that rook, have to defend it, and Ullman might be able to invade. Like he could go rook e1 and rook e7, and with these pieces completely out of play, this looks extremely dangerous. Takes, rook b4 was played, rook e1. So again, problems are mounting, but Fischer is up to task. Play like Fischer. So first off, let's try to identify the problem. What's black's main issue? There are many issues here, but what's the main issue at the moment? That the rook is about to enter the 7th, which would mean there'd be mating threats which Fischer wouldn't want to see. Yes? Our other problem is these guys. So, if we could win time, we could develop those guys and win the game. Also, be back in a second. Meanwhile, try to find the solution. So I see bishop e5. Why bishop e5 though? Bishop e5 wins time as the queen has to move if he wants to chase the bishop away and the queen. Okay, it's shutting down the open file. Yes. So bishop e5 is a big time move by Fischer. And yes, this looks very dangerous, but Fischer is a concrete player. He understands that Ullmann will need to waste time to attack. Right now, he can't open it up because bishop f4 doesn't threaten much. It's actually really bad, so let's say bishop f6. But then I have knight d7, and in due time, my knight will take the bishop's position, and black is just dominating. So in fact, black is not that many moves behind. If he gets to develop 2 more pieces quickly, then he might be doing just fine. Queen d1. And as the chat mentioned, Ullmann is preparing f4. So first, as we usually do, what do we have to look for? Is there any threats? Do we have to care about anything in this position? Yeah, we do have to care about that pin. He took. It's true, as the chat mentions, that f4 we can check, so we're not losing because of this pin. Because it's a check, you have to deal with it. But there are issues here. The issues being, once this bishop has lost this outpost, you can't put anything there because I just take it with the pawn. My rook will invade, and Ullmann will gain big counterplay here. So definitely something that Fischer didn't want. Fischer decides to grab another pawn. Now queen takes a4 might not seem logical, but think about it this way. The queen was in an X-ray, which you usually don't want to have your queen in. Second of all, you take a pawn, and you also hit this queen on d1. Does the endgame favor white or black? Yeah, it does look great, right? Looks great for black. 2 pawns up. Only thing we need to do is develop in due time. So, if I take on a4, you take back. And if I play f4, what will you do, dear chat? And this is very important. Always keep your eyes on the prize. So queen a4, it can be dangerous. You have to calculate it. And I'm sure that actually Ullman and Fisher both did calculate that option. So how many pawns do we need to win a game? And this is a very important concept in chess. Not just asking for fun. Yes, we only need one pawn to win the game. So do we need to take the third pawn? Really? Nope, we do not. We do not. So let's say takes here, f4, check here, and knight d7. Because development is important. I don't know. I might have said that before someplace, sometime. The development is important. Anyways, what Black achieves here is that he mobilizes his pieces. Yes, White might activate the rook, but is not as dangerous when our pieces were still in the back rank. And even, for example, Bishop takes b2 is almost a decisive blunder, because after rook e8, let's say rook b1, actually rook b1 is not that bad, but maybe f5, and this rook will never move anymore, because one time you move the knight, I take your rook. So you're pinned forever, pinned for life. You could even go bishop e7 and take this d6 pawn. So that is why don't forget to develop when you're up pawns or a piece. You still follow the rules of chess. And that's something very important to keep in mind. Yep, Arsenal fan Richie, you're correct. If, let's say here, knight d7, if rook e7, I can go knight f6. I'm not afraid of opposite colored endgames, which we will see as in the future, because we're up a pawn, and this bishop is much stronger than this bishop on d3, because this one is lording down the board, occasionally sets up some mating ideas, and also supports pawn pushes. Either the c pawn can become a big threat, combined with this superpower bishop, or the a pawn. But let's go back to our game. Queen a4 actually was played. So takes, knight d7, rook e7, and knight f6. We're in game. So again, this is something to remember. Whenever you have a better position, you don't have to fear the opposite colors. Because yes, that gives chances for a draw, but it's not a given. And in fact, I had this talk before with Ilya that even though some things are drawable, that doesn't mean you don't suffer making that draw. So knight f6 is a very strong move. Rook takes b7, knight h5. And now you can see how powerful this bishop is. Knight g3 is a big threat. King h2. And let's stop here for a second. Let's observe the situation. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. How would you evaluate this position right now, chat? I start with the idea that white still does have the bishop there. It still has a rook on b7. What does black have in exchange for that? Ozina Fenrichi says black has better minor pieces. White has a better rook. I would say better rook because this f1 rook is not that awesome. It would be awesome if you could open up the position. So yeah, white does have weak b and d pawns. This is a potential target on d5 and b2. So black has a better pawn structure even though he doesn't have the bishop pair. Now, if you don't have the bishop pair, what you should be aiming for is the one not having the bishop pair. And that will actually help you find the move that Fischer played here. Notable 75. Thank you for rating with a party of 3. Hope you had a great stream. Right here and right now, we're looking at Benoni Classics. This one is between Ullman and Fischer. Feel free to join. Here we're wondering how Fischer continued if we know that Fischer is trying to get rid of Ullman's bishop pair. It's 1970s. Push him, baby. So I see a move suggestion, that is bishop e3. Chat, do you understand the idea behind bishop e3? Because it is the boss move. So Fischer understands that he has a good position, but you can improve your position by exchanging off your opponent's strong pieces. This bishop on g5 can be super annoying, setting up mating threats on the back rank. Could go bishop e7, attacking this d6 pawn, which does need defense. But bishop e3 actually goes against that. In what way does bishop e3 stop Ullman from creating counterplay? Hey Marty. So chess training says f5, f6 was unpleasant otherwise. Okay, so it is in some ways a defensive move, but what is the idea behind it? Someday actually asks a funny question. Does engines agree with bishop e3? So one of the interesting tidbits about Fischer is that he was one of the first players who were really accurate. So you can guess that it might be one of the best moves in the position because Fischer was a very efficient calculator. This is one of the first ones who looked for the absolute best in the position, much like a computer does these days. Yeah, pins the bishop to f4, but also Fischer is putting pressure on this f4 pawn. And apart from trying to get rid of this f4 pawn, he is aiming to do something that is very important when you have a winning position. So when you have a winning position, what are you looking to do? What is the technique that most great players use when they know that they have a better position? a pawn up, a piece up, or just with a big advantage? Indeed, Paragon, to simplify the position. So I'm not saying that rook b4 isn't an option. Problem is, I could take, could go bishop e7 and there'll be counterplay. I can also go b3, and this knight is still a little bit out of place with some play for white. So rook b4 is by no means a bad move, but bishop e3 is more and better. It is actually simplifying the position, and it's trying to liquidate into something that leads to a good position. You're asking what happens after g3. So let's try to answer that question. So g3 was not played, but if we understand that g3 is a weakening move, and that's kind of the reasons why you don't want to push those pawns in front of your king. Now this king is vulnerable to the second rank. Also, this king has to protect more pawns, especially the one on g3. And if we know that there's a potential weakness on the second rank, we might actually find the move. Quite simple and logical for black. Yes, Paragon, Bonhus, and chess training, you're all correct. Rook d4 is a monster move here. You have to move the bishop, but then I hit you with rook d2. Let's say bishop b1. Not losing, and knight g3 is even checkmate. And what proves? Nothing more that bishop e3 is the best move in the position that you can checkmate in the upcoming moves. So this is quite a brutal threat. So Ullmann can't play g3 because rook d4 almost just wins on the spot afterwards. If you go here, here. So if you go rook b3, there is, I think, c4, forking. If you go rook d1, I can go bishop f2. And again, you have plenty of problems with your pawns on f4 and g3. And this is probably going to hurt if you're playing white here. So that's the reason Ullmann decided not to defend that pawn, but from there it goes downhill pretty quickly. The bishop e2 is played. Now, how should we simplify the position? And this is an important part. There's a reason I stop here. So I see Arsenal fan Richie say bishop takes f4, Gaborovich say knight takes f4. Okay, so the question is the following. Why would you take with the bishop? If you're pro bishop takes f4, tell me so. Why would you take with the knight? Bishop f4 feels like a Bobby move, says Jamix RS. Could be. Might as well be. Bishop is more forcing. So when you're up some material, what are the two things you should be looking for? One, you want to simplify, but two, you want to avoid one thing, and that's important. You don't want to oversimplify the position. What ways would knight takes f4 oversimplify? Or potentially oversimplify? It's not even given that Ullmann would exchange everything. f6 never looks enticing. f6 is a no-no move. J-mix. Opposite color bishops. Yes. Bishop f4 was played. Exclam. If knight takes f4, white might consider going bishop f3, but with bishop f4, yes, I told you, probably this is winning, but this can prove to be technically a little bit difficult to convert because of the opposite colors. So bishop f4 is played more to exchange off these bishops. Then Ullmann does not have the bishop pair anymore, and Fischer is just up a pawn. Hello there, Sleepy Lee. So J-Mix is saying that f6, what's wrong with that? On principle, when you have a near winning position or something that you should be able to win, you don't want to create problems for yourself. If you play f6 here, you create issues. For yourself, you create weaknesses along this rank. You don't want to do that. You want to keep it as clean as possible. And that's why bishop f4 is such a great move. Hey there, Fuchsia. Bishop f4, rook takes f4. Now, once Fischer exchanges off these bishops, this is turning into a beautiful win. Rook b6, we still have to be careful. And now we have to decide which pawn to keep. Because it's a double attack, a6 and d6 is hanging. Which one would you keep, dear chat? Which one is worth more? Pintle says the D. Palm says the d6. Maxi GG1 says the d6. Keep the d6. 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 Avoiding passed pawn. Sam Gamer 666 d6. J-Mix jumping on the bandwagon. Good, good. So it's very important to keep this pawn, because if we lose this pawn, then this d pawn can become very annoying, and also we would have many pawn islands. So Fischer makes sure that there's only one pawn island. I mean, these two, and he gives this a6 pawn away. Bishop takes a6. And the last question I'm going to ask in this position is the following. Which piece is the strongest in the endgame? And it is not the queen, I tell you. It's not the queen. It is definitely the king. So now, if we know that the king is the strongest game, we need to find a game plan, and that one will actually seal the deal. This is an Ullmann-Fischer game. So it's black to move and come up with a decisive maneuver. And it's not as concrete as you might think it is. Sometimes you can just use strategy in chess. I know. Everyone is concentrated on something else, tactics, whatever, winning on the lottery, but sometimes you don't win on lotteries. You just come up with a good plan and then you execute it. Chess can be just pure strategy. So we already know that we want a king maneuver. But question number 2, why do we care so much about a king maneuver here? Where can we find potential targets in white's position? Yeah, the d5 pawn is juicy. So now the king will run up and attack it. His Royal Highness will be on a journey to capture that pawn. King g7, and this is the beginning of the end, my friend. Bishop b5, and the king is walking. It's all paved for the king. Now the king attacked it, but Ulman could find a defensive move. But will that save Ulman? Will that save him? Hello there, wise one. What was the decisive blow? Which piece needed to join the battle? Yes, the pony, the mighty horseman, will join the battle and take the pawn. Fischer defends everything, and this is something to remember. Whenever you're winning, you have the big advantage. Make sure your stuff is defended. Because if you don't have your pieces defended, oftentimes you get into trouble because you lose your material back. You can't win the game anymore. So make sure all of your guys are defended. Check. King d4. Run in forward. This king is marching. Rook d7. Knight f6. And Ulman resigned. Why didn't he take that pawn? Why didn't he take that pawn? That pawn is hanging. Yeah. Well, Ullman saw that you can't take that pawn because suddenly rook would be trapped. You can't go here. Knight takes away that square. You can't jump over your own pieces, and this square is protected by the pawn. And suddenly, this rook is captured. Shocking. And Fischer won. So this was the classical game, Ullman-Fischer. Now, it's interesting to see games from the 1970s. And there was a fantastic player from Baku who liked this game a lot. Can anybody tell me who was that player? One of the most famous players from Baku. Any guesses? I'm sure you've heard of him. No way you didn't. And he was a young lad in the early 1970s. I mean, late 1970s, that is. Someday, he was not born in Baku. Carlsen was not born in Baku. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. It was played against Mageramov, who was one of his sparring partners. And his name is Gary Kimovich Kasparov. And this game is between Mageramov and Kasparov. Yep, Kasparov was born in Baku, yes. And you'll see the resemblance of the previous game. Just watch. No more talking, just watch. Bear with me. So d4, knight f6, c4. This game was played in 1979. c5, d5, e6, ed, cd, d6, knight f3. We talked about this before. e4, f4 is the most dangerous way of playing here, but they didn't know that at the time. Knight f3, g6, e4, bishop g7. And that's kind of the difference when you see a junior game or a super grandmaster slash grandmaster game. As we've seen in the previous game, Fischer played an early a6, circumventing any checks and bishop b5s. Now Kasparov goes and plays bishop g7 immediately instead. It doesn't mean this is a bad approach. It means that grandmasters have their very, very elaborate ways of playing certain positions. Papadatos, thank you for following. So, bishop e2, castle, castle. And if you remember the previous game, what is that important thing that Kasparov remembered from that Benoni classic played by Fischer? So what are we trying to achieve in this position? Which pieces are misplaced for black that we would like to get rid of? We want to exchange the bad bishop indeed. How can we achieve that? Oh yeah, bishop g4. Bishop g4. And Kasparov is aiming to get rid of this bishop. Yes, Magaramov will get the bishop pair, but in exchange, we'll get a great position, meaning he won't have to deal with this miserable bishop on c8. Bishop f4, rook e8. If you look at this game, does this remind you of something? I wonder what would he play if white plays h3. Of course, h3, knight takes e4. And this is actually, without the inclusion of a6, a4, exactly the same combination that we've seen in the Fischer game. So I think Kasparov was hoping a little bit to get into this position. But Magaramov sidesteps that and defends this pawn. Now, we play a6. What is the point of a6 again, if it's not about defending the d6 pawn? What is the idea behind it? Chat? If it's not defensive, as at the moment it's not that much defensive, because if knight b5, this pawn would still be hanging. Yeah, you want to prepare the idea of b5, which would prepare the idea of playing b4, chasing this knight away, and then we would have more pieces attacking this pawn than how many defends it. Now, if you look at it, I have just two attackers, two defenders, and if it's the same number of attackers and defenders, that means you can't take that pawn. But if your opponent doesn't have enough defenders, that means there are less people defending than people attacking it, then you can take it. Therefore, b5, b4 would be pretty nasty. So Magaramov stops that. Actually, he doesn't. But first off, chases this bishop away. Bishop f3, bishop takes f3. So, white does get the bishop pair, but now it's much easier to play the position for black. Is it equality yet? That's still kind of debatable. But it is somewhat of an achievement for Kasparov. Queen c7. So let's try to understand, why did Kasparov play queen c7 in this position? Why did he play queen c7? In fact, he has a specific idea in mind. It's not rocket science, by the way, but it's good to know why you play certain moves. Queen c7 is a good one. Thank you for the follow, Fubiko. So usually you want to develop with your pieces first. Why didn't he do that? Why didn't he develop without queen c7? Well, for the reason that it would drop the pawn. So if knight d7, then there's bishop takes d6 and you lose the pawn. You don't want to do that. So he plays queen c7. Mind you, you could also go queen e7, but probably he didn't like the rook facing. Because oftentimes, white manages to open up the position with e5 and then your queen will be under fire. So Kasparov decides to put it on queen c7, and this pawn is just a good blockader, so your queen will be not harmed. Also, it prepares this idea of knight d7. So now Magaramov played a4, stopping this b5 break. Knight c4. So c4 actually has a double function. You gain space, but also you create potential outposts for this b8 knight, which will be a d7 knight, and which can post on d3 or b3. There's also a third post that this Benoni knight likes to occupy. Which one is that? So Evan Star, what's very important in chess is that A, you want to take space. B, it's very important to develop your pieces first and push pawns later. If you push pawns early, you might start being behind in development. So Kasparov can put the knight on d3 or b3, but where else could Kasparov put his knight? e5, of course. This knight can hop to e5 as well, hitting this bishop, and you can still go to d3. But okay, let's see what happened. a5. So a5 can be a little annoying because it stops b5 breaks, which you can still do, but it will create lots of pawn islands and weaknesses in the black's camp. Also, sometimes white can go bishop e3, bishop b6, or knight a4, knight b6. And if that happens, that's a sign that your position is bad in the Benoni. Knight d7, rook a4. So now rook a4 is trying to stop you from playing knight c5, because if you go there, I can take on c4. But that's why we know more than one plans in chess. It's not working there, Simply Luca. So if knight c5 doesn't work, it's good to know that we have options. What options we have? We actually considered it already. Yeah, knight e5. So yes, b5 is an option, but it's very sketchy at times. As we talked about it, there'd be many pawn weaknesses then. So Kasparov decides to be more conservative. He decides he has a good enough position. He does not need to play b5 yet. So once we played knight e5, which is a very strong move, hitting this bishop on f3, planning to plant that knight on d3. What does this knight e5 move allow us to do? So we have a beautiful knight on e5. What can we do now with this f6 bishop, since that knight on a d7 have already moved? What is something that we could play for here? Yeah, so we can bring the other knight to c5. Knight f6, d7, and knight c5. And then those two octopuses will be very annoying, hitting on the rook. And by now, this knight is defending the c4 pawn, so we will not have any trouble with that. Now, I think white should have played bishop e2, nevertheless, keeping the bishops and putting some pressure on the c4 pawn. He took on e5. What's wrong with bishop takes e5? What could be the problem with this move? What do we know in general about opposite colored bishops in the middle game? Or in general? It's better if we have some knowledge in the middle game, but if we know some generalities, that's good. Indeed, the g7 bishop will become unopposed. There's no one who can stop it now. So you'll see how Kasparov is going to use that. Now, in the middle game, Kutuzov Gambit, it's different. It's not that drawish. In fact, it can be used for something that we see as an attack. So you can attack with that bishop. Rook takes e5. And the reason is that it is unopposed now. This bishop can never really do any damage to this bishop. Bishop e2, rook e8. Now, if you would take on c4 with the bishop, I could take on e4. Takes. And there's a big difference between these two bishops. This bishop is biting granite, while this bishop can easily start attacking the king. In this sense, this is a fun opening. If things go well, it goes really well for the Benoni side, meaning the black side. Here, this bishop is just monstrous, and black often gets big mating attacks here. So we're worried about f4. So f4, you can just hop back to e7, and you still have threats on this e4 square. So to be honest with you, apart from playing for the strengths of the position, namely the g7 bishop, you also want to target the e4 pawn, which is your main target in this whole system of the Benoni. So rook takes a4 is played, queen takes a5. Now something that I do want to mention is, even if you would lose that c4 pawn, that wouldn't matter at all. Why? Because this bishop on g7 is so much cooler than its counterpart, it's worth a pawn. And that you can see in many other games, that sometimes if your pieces are higher on quality, feel free to sack a pawn for them that time. f3 is a reasonable move, but it would do something which would make this move a little bit dubious. Why would this move be a little dubious? What does this create for white? I mean for black. It weakens the dark squares. And why is that such a big deal? Well, because we have an unopposed dark squared bishop. So after, say, knight h5, I will have potential jumps, and one bishop d4 check might even turn out to be deadly. So f3 in these type of positions can create too many holes in white's camp. So that's not quite true. f3 can be a good move, but make sure that in that case your pawn is on h2 and then you can survive. But in this case, this is more like Swiss cheese because there are way too many dark square weaknesses in this position. Takes, queen takes a5, f4, rook e7. Now, if you're looking at this position, we could be content. I guess most of us would take black here. But it's not enough just to have a good position. You also need to find a plan. So how could we take control of this game? What should be black's plan here? Thank you for the follow, Jacob2712. Plans, people, plans. What should be a typical Benoni plan here? Now, be realistic. Can we get to the b2 pawn? Or if we say so, how can we get there? I refer back, National Master Dale, to the being realistic part. So we all know that our main target is on e4. And if we can undermine it successfully, then our position will be just wonderful. So b5, b4 is indeed the big plan. You will see, done by Kasparov himself. Bishop f3 and b5. Now Kasparov starts rolling that pawn, mostly to undermine this knight. So if you count these pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4 defenders, if you can destabilize that guy on c3, this can become a potential target and this pawn on e4. Let's see what happens. b5, rook c6. So the rook can't really go to d4 because I have queen b6. You get pinned, I move my knight away and I win the exchange. That's something you wouldn't want to do. So Magaramov is forced to play rook c6. Now there's 1, 2, 3 defenders, 3 attackers. Still tied up. But after b4, the tie is broken. Now b4, and it's almost collapsing. Now when your opponent plays b4, or I mean when we play b4 that is, there's a classic counterpunch from white. What is that counterpunch that Magaramov played here? e5, indeed. So e5, even though this does not save white, but it deserves an exclamation point for resourcefulness. e5 often muddies the water and can be potentially advantageous for white to break up the structure like this. If black takes on e5, often white can go d6, get the knight to some more active squares, and this bishop, as you've seen, is not as open as before. So now Kasparov plays the best way, the best possible way in this position, giving no counterplay and keeping his pieces active. So it's Kasparov to move and play. Oh yeah, b takes c3. Why do I think this is such a great practical choice by Kasparov? Well, he wants to keep this bishop active, targeting these pawns and might be getting closer to that king. Ef takes bc. Now we do count the pieces, it's roughly even, but who has the more active pieces? It's clearly Kasparov. So he goes rook e1. Point being that he realizes that in the attack, this bishop is basically useless. So there's not much defending going on around there. Note, as Arsenal fan Richie points out, there's no rook takes d6 because queen c5 check, and I would take your rook. In fact, I'd take both of them, but that is the reason white is not even dreaming about doing that. Rook e1, queen d3. So, we can see that the position is better for for black. Obviously, it's better for black. So, what should be our goal? You already have a rook on the first rank. So what are you trying to achieve with queen to a1, Abdel Mohammed? And that's very important sometimes to think about the reasons you want to play certain moves. I understand the moves. I play the game of chess. But why do we play queen a1? Well, because we want to checkmate. So in fact, Kasparov will be going for checkmate. He played rook f1 instead. If king takes f1, then queen a1 can be very annoying, and that would also be very close to checkmate. So he plays queen f1, bishop c3. And now you see the benefits of having an opposite colored bishop middle game. With this rook cut off from defense, this bishop unable to stop the infiltration of this dark squared bishop, Magaramov is completely hopeless here. He takes a6, and Kasparov to move and finish it off. A very stylish finish. An elegant one by Kasparov. So Arsenal fan Richie, queen d8 is a little bit too passive. I don't think I'm telling too much secrets with that. Rook e1 is an option. So as the goal is to win the game, I assume draw is not good enough. Thank you for the follow, Big C. So when you want to checkmate, think forward. And I can see some of you in the chat already got the answer. So which one of our pieces is a little bit misplaced? We could just put it into a little bit of a better spot. We would win immediately. And that is the lady. A5. That's why bishop d4 is played. Kasparov actually wants to do the same thing you did, Arsenal fan Richie, but with bishop d4, it's easier because we give a check, we win time that way, and then queen e1 wins because bishop g1, bishop f2, and bishop g3 is checkmate. You try to stop the invasion, you're too late, you get checked, check again, bishop g3 is checkmate. And this is why, actually, why it is important to think about pieces and the pieces that are not participating in the battle. And if you would logically say, okay, so this bishop is useful. I might want to put it in a better square, but it's relatively useful on c3. This rook is on the open file. Rooks are supposed to be on the open file. This queen is not doing much. How can I create a real ruling queen out of this lady? And then you realize, I'll check you. You hide, but now I can find this beautiful square on e1, and once you position all of your pieces properly, the game is easier. Thank you for the follow, Le Bomley. So this was a big win by Mr. Gary Kasparov. That is actually the reason you should know chess history. Because now you know that this knight takes e4 sacrifice does work. You know that since the Ullmann Fischer game. So, the other thing that I wanted to show you is another Fischer classic. And that is played between Gligorich and Fischer. So before I show that game, can anybody tell me what opening ideas or concepts Fischer is famous for? It's not only one, there's many that is famous and has been played by Fischer. Meaning novel ideas in chess. E4 has been known to be a good move. I mean concepts. And when I talk about concepts, is like that knight h5 move in the Benoni. Okay? So, without further ado, let's get there. Fischer's novel concept. So I will show you a game that will make this one much more understandable, and then I will even mention that Fischer concept that he's really famous for. In fact, that happened in the game Fischer Anderson, Ulf Anderson. So wow, another Benoni. D6, knight f3, bishop g7. So this time, bishop plays bishop g7. Probably he played early a6 because of bishop f4 in the previous case. So the previous game went like this, and he played a6 to stop any knight b5 ideas or queen a4 checks when he could go knight d7. But this game was knight f3, g6, e4, castles, castles, and this is an old classical way of playing. Rook e8, knight d2. This is somewhat of a passive system by white, but he does over-defend this e4 pawn, which makes it viable. Knight d7, a4. Why does white play a4 here? And again, as often the case in these type of positions, moves often have two ideas in mind. So this a4 move actually has a dual purpose. What are those? So you do want to put the knight on c4, and that is often can be parried by b5. It also stabilizes the situation because there will be no a6 b5 move coming up because you can always take with ab. That's why a4 is played here. I give it a good move sign. So, if this pawn is over defended, we would like to play a6 b5, but it's kind of hard to achieve. This bishop on c8 doesn't really have too much scope. So we know that white eventually will start and pile on d6. That begs the question, how should we continue then? Note, because of the fact that we have much less space with black, we must play actively. So let's try to find some active moves. Yes, knight e5 is an important move. And it is exclam-worthy. Knight b6 is not the place you want to put it. And this is one of those important principles. Let's say black plays this h6 move, which is not particularly good. You don't really want to move these pawns, if not necessary. Knight c4, and then you might go knight e5, attacking this guy. Because note, this knight c4 attacks this d6 pawn, so you have to deal with it. If you play passively, don't do that. Bishop f8, that would mean that white has a big advantage. So black can counter it in two ways. You can play knight e5 or knight b6. Here you can play knight b6, trying to drive away the knight, and because you have less space, it's okay to exchange off the knight and put the knight on b6. Otherwise, you never want to put that knight on b6. So knight e5 is definitely the most aggressive way of playing. You might ask what happens if f4, then you have knight g4 and setting up knight e3 ideas. And because this queen is very close to queen h4, this actually is very good for black. Black does get real play against the white king on g1. So queen c2 is played, and eventually Gligorich is going to prepare h3 and f4. Seeing that, Fischer comes up with an idea that has never been seen in the practice of the game. So we already know what white is trying to achieve, right? So white is trying to play h3 and f4. But Fischer stops that idea with a new concept. It's not knight h5. And it's not a blunder, Evan Starr. Yes, g5. A brilliant, brilliant move. Let's try to understand this g5 move. What could be the point of g5 here? It does stop f4. So f4 we would take it. But what is g5 really what is g5 trying to accomplish really? And that's actually what makes this g5 move so good. We create a dark square grip, yes. We own important dark squares. And also, we stabilize that pony on e5, which normally wouldn't happen in other cases. And since then, we know that we're always happy to give away this bishop for any knight coming to f5 or g4. We don't really care. We would be happy to exchange it off. So as long as we have enough pressure on f5, black has decent play. So what Fischer says, that I'm willing to weaken my white squares because I will always be able to get rid of a knight on f5, and also in return I will have a monstrous pony on e5. Knight f3. So Grigorich goes at knight f3, immediately switching up the plans. Takes, h6. But the problem with this one is the following. It's an exchange. Also, I have another knight that I can post on e5 anytime I want to. So knight f3 was probably not the most critical way of playing this structure. So bishop d2, a6. This eventually has to be played to stop knight b5 ideas. Also, another times you go rook b8 and b5. Bishop e2. And now, once this bishop moves to e2, it's clear that you're not going to be able to break with b5, and so you look for a different plan. Yes, you can. And that is queen e7, hitting on the e4 pawn. Rook a1, queen a5. So what could be the benefit of bringing this queen to e5? Any ideas? Yes, definitely stops e5 breaks. What else? What is that queen doing there? So jumping Jackson, if f4 can always check you and still have pressure on the e4 pawn. So if f4, I can check and play knight takes e4, winning the pawn. That is kind of the reason Fischer moved it there, so he can check there on d4 and then take on that e4 pawn. The reason he didn't take on e4 immediately because after a bishop move, there would be a lot of pressure on the queen and the rook. King h1, just stepping out and preparing f4. Now Fischer plays queen d4. This is an unusual maneuver yet again. If bishop e3 is played, you can go to b4, and this queen is surprisingly useful on b4 as well, hitting on this b2 pawn and the e4 pawn. And now black would have good play, and with the queen supporting this b5 break, you can go bishop d7 and b5, as mentioned. So even though these weird maneuvers, queen e5, queen d4 is, to be honest with you, is kind of rare, even in modern practice, but it's good to remember that the queen on b4 can be very useful in the Benoni. Then you could go bishop d7 and play b5. So even if white would go back to d2, that actually threatens nothing. Let's say if I go bishop d7, whenever this knight jumps, the e4 pawn will be hanging. So you do not have to fear a bishop on d2. You have to fear this bishop on d2 whenever there's a vacant square on d5 or e4, because those jumps could threaten some big issues. Here it's not a big deal because you have targets on e4. Thank you for following King Vicky and Schutzig. So f3 was played. Now he plays knight h5. And notice how Fischer is playing around these dark squares. He's putting his pawns on dark squares and brings his pieces to those dark squares. Knight h5 actually is useful for two reasons. One, it wants to occupy the f4 square. Two, it activates this bishop. And now queen b4 will be even more powerful, as the b2 pawn can eventually become a target. So as you can see, this position is quite decent now for black. Black has a nice dark squared blockade. Knight h5, knight f4. And here, actually, Gligorich was hallucinating. He played knight b5, which is not good. AB, bishop b5, and probably, just as you guys, he did not believe that this queen can be invulnerable, untouchable on d4. And thought that, okay, now your rook is attacked, then there's bishop c3 and the queen is trapped. But forgot about queen e5 and it's suddenly game over. Because even if you attack this lady, I just drop back on e7 and I'm up 2 pieces. So a lot of times, these shocking concepts are dealt with in different ways. So Gligorich tried to point out that, hey, I've never seen this concept before, and I don't think it's correct. So he went all the way out to punish Fischer for his audacity. But it turns out the thing that he thought is the best is just not good. Hello there, Frappuccino. So he tried to trap the queen, but you can't, and after queen e5, the game will soon be over. Bishop c3, queen e7, takes. And the reason this position is so good for black is manifold. Well, black still has a good blockade, and if you have a blockade, these rooks cannot really penetrate, and if those rooks cannot penetrate, it'll be quite easy to win the game. Also, you can break through with f4, which would be very bad news for Fischer, as this king is, to be honest with you, still a little bit unsafe on g7. But for example, queen c3, now as you want to block up the position, you might go f6, Or you can use this blockading move, queen e5. Takes, and now as the position closes up, eventually the bishop and knight will overtake the rook. So b4 was played, which is principled on nature, but is just not good enough. Unfortunately for Gligorich, he's trying to open up the position for the rooks, and that is the principled way of playing. cb, queen b2, queen e5. So I often see people saying that, oh, you should take a pawn, you should take that pawn, but what's most important in these type of positions is to consolidate. And if you can consolidate your position, you're up a piece, you have two pieces for a rook, that's more important than just measly pawns. So here, Fischer is just trying to consolidate. Queen b4, knight f4. And this is another important thing to do. Even if your position becomes excruciatingly good, and you wouldn't have imagined but you're already winning, still don't ditch your plans. Still put your knight on the best spot that you already want to put it on. So Fischer puts that knight on f4, and guess what? That was his original concept, and he follows it up. And this is one of the things that I see in amateur games. You decide to do something, and then you ditch it in the last second for some unknown reason. Follow up your plans, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But still, that's something you want to do. So knight f4, therefore, is such a great move. Hey there, Knight Cheer. Also, shout out to Knight Cheer. Let me give a bit of a shout out, even though she played the Fortnite. She is a chess streamer, so check her out. Has some good old puzzle streams that you might want to take a look at. So, now this knight is a boss on f4. We have the queen there. This is no longer a weakness. And if we could get closer to those pawns, the game will be over. Rook d1, d6. So what Fischer is doing is that he's trying to activate the bishop. Rook f2, but pow, knight d3. Tactics, which is a very elegant solution. Forking the rook and queen, and you can't really take it because queen a1 check, and you have many people, but none is ready to deal with the back rank issues. Queen b6, and after this, it is game over. Fischer is up a whole piece. Rook a1, and now Fischer systematically exchanges off Gligorich's pieces. He's up a piece, he doesn't mind exchanges. Queen e1, but this is too passive, and the reason he plays rook a2 instead of taking, that he realizes with these passive pieces, he might be able to checkmate as well. Queen g3, queen b2, h4, rook a1, and black won the game, because after the exchanges, takes, here I can go queen e5, and after the exchange on e5, I have a winning endgame. So this was a very nice win by Bobby Fischer. So last but not least, I want to show a game that will pinpoint how you can play this g5 system. So let's take a look at that one as well. Also, in the chat, do let me know if you like this game from Fischer. Hello there, Toro. So, for playing Fisher's concept. So this game is played between Sigulski and Mihai Shuba. Shuba was a legendary player. I don't think he plays that much anymore, but he was famous for original ideas, and this time he is going to borrow one of Fisher's specialty. He also was famous for playing the Benoni. So this game is played in 1986, which is many, many years after the previous game, played by Kasparov and Fischer. Let's take a look at it. Kim Big Golf is saying, love watching you go over games. Thank you. Appreciate it. I hope it's helpful. So d4, knight f3, c5. So originally we've seen this way of playing, but then they realized that this is not that good because of this f4, e5 ideas. So they switched it up and they do it from the Nimzo order and then they play c5. Paragon, thank you for the 50 bits. Really enjoy the instructive Benoni. Can't speak. Yet again. Paragon, thank you for the 50 bits. I really enjoyed the instructive Benoni lesson today. Glad to hear that. Glad to hear that. So, he's using the e6 method. Knight f3, c5. The point is that as this knight is already committed to f3, there won't be e4 f4s that Sigulski can play. d5, d6, knight c3, takes, g6. So this is much, much different than we've seen before. e4, bishop g7, bishop e2, knight d2, and guess what? This is exactly the Gligorich-Fischer game. And we're going to say how to play this type of structure. Knight d7, a4, g5. So he is preparing this knight e5 move. Queen c2, knight e5. In fact, this is the same position, and Sigulski played knight f3 here. So, white plays this kind of strange move of rook a3. But the point of rook a3 is to move out of this ideas, also sometimes to put some pressure on the b pawn with rook b3. And this looks kind of strange, but it also has this idea of bringing the rook later on to the f-file. Now, not yet, of course, because the knight is in the way, but will be an idea once white breaks through with f4. But let's not rush forward that quickly. Knight d7. And this is new. We haven't seen knight d7 before. Obviously because knight f3 was the move played in the Gligorich game. Was the Gligorich-Fischer. So he played the better move, rook a3, knight d7. So let's try to understand before we see the solution. Why is Shuba bringing the knight to d7? Let's try to understand these moves. While I read the chat for a second. Ifar is saying, thanks Boros, you're welcome. Always nice to see you. Historic games are fascinating, right? So this is one of those important things, Jumpin' Jackson, that I was talking about. We have a concept, we want to follow it. Our main concept here was having an e5 knight and supported by the g5 pawn. We're trying to play on dark squares. How can we play on dark squares in this position? So where is this knight going to? This knight on d7. Get your strategic hat on. Yeah, so this knight wants to go to g6. But is that the final destination it's going to? Yeah, as DK Guy points out, in fact, it wants to go to f4. Now, eventually, if we have enough pieces to support f5, we might play that. Jump in Jackson, but not yet. Eventually, we might get there. But at the moment, we want this knight to maneuver itself to the king side and get our knight on f4. Also, just a reminder, do we like the bishop in this type of structures? Hello there, Frappuccino. Do we like that white squared bishop? Do we mind? Do we really want to part it with it or not? Yeah, we don't mind getting rid of it. No, not really. We don't care for it. If we can exchange it off, go have it. Have a nice day. White, enjoy your extra white squared bishop. But okay, so we're wanting to get this knight to f4. Knight d1. And this is an interesting plan. This rook might even join the attack, as with this g5 move, we did create a bit of a weakness on the king side and a weakness on f5. So don't forget that this g5 maneuver is risky. Interesting, but risky. Knight f8, a nice move, preparing this maneuver. Preparing the knight f8, g6, f4 maneuver. f3. f3 is probably a little slow. Knight e3 is probably better, trying to get the knight to f5. But white is playing a little bit conservatively here. Take care, Fuxia. Knight g6, and now look at that. We have two beautiful ponies, and our bishop is ready to attack along the diagonal. g3, just circumventing any knight jumps. And here, actually, black comes up with a brilliant, brilliant idea. So far, we achieved what we could. We have a beautiful bishop. Our knights are well placed. So we have to decide which side of the board we want to play on. And we have options here. Let's think about this before we come up with a rash decision. So which side of the board we want to play on? There's only two sides of the board, just a reminder. There's a king side and there's a queen side. Kutuzov says king side. Arzan says let's play on the queen side. So if we think about it, where do we see all of white pieces scattered? By that, you could have a good guess where you want your pieces at. Paragon has a great point. Since most of our pieces are on the king side, I think king side. That's true. But also, chess is played with two people playing. So first off, where can we see white's pieces stationing at? Where can you see them? Most of them. So most of them are on the queen side. And that's a sign that it's kind of difficult to play for b5. So it's natural when you see no pieces defending the king that you would attack on the king side. Played king h8, which kind of reminds me of this famous game Fischer Anderson, where Fischer played king h8, rook g8, and g5 in a hedgehog structure, even though with reversed colors. So, king h8 was played here to prepare ideas of attacking this king and bringing the rook closer. Also, he's going to go h5, h4, trying to open up the position. So, knight e3, h5. So we know that we're going to play on this side of the board. If knight f5 is played, we already know the answer. You're just going to take it because we're happy to get rid of this bishop. Now if f4, that's the moment you realize this move was very useful, because after exchanges, you will have your rook immediately staring at the white king. But that is good and nothing new. We need to decide how we will be opening up the position. So we just need to find a way to open up the position here. So don't forget, Sigulski is hoping for f4. This pawn actually stops that because after the exchanges, we'll get an open file which is beneficial for black. If you play g4, I can just push through with f4 and you don't get the position opened up. So that's not good news there. In fact, h4 is played, and this is for the following reason. If g4, I have this idea of, let's say, taking and getting this knight to f4. And yes, black doesn't have a mating attack. I can still play on the queen side, but white's king is extremely weak in this case. So you wouldn't want to do that and deal with that. Knight takes g7, king takes g7. In fact, this is surprising. This is surprising me as well. Shuba is even giving up the bishop, the dark squared bishop, which is crazy because usually in 90% of the cases, you don't want to do that. But this is a big exception. And the reason is the following. Shuba is going for a mating attack. So if you think about concepts, how can we set up a mating attack for Shuba? Open the H file, continue. Obviously, we're going to open up the H file, but with what constellation can we break through? Yeah? I guess you mean Rook H8, Flipper Squad. So what Black is trying to do is go Rook H8, Rook H7, and Queen H8. And then bring the tractor, that is the Rook, into White's position, and then just mayhem would show up. Rook F2 is played, takes, Rook H8. Knight F1, Rook H3. Just putting pressure on G3 immediately. Now Queen H8, Rook H3, Queen H8, Rook H1 is almost mating. Rook G2, trying to sneak away from the trouble. Will he do it? Will he be able to do that? That's a good question. Queen H8, of course, threatening Rook H8. Now, Sigulski played Knight H2, just blocking the view. So for now, Sigulski managed to fend off the attack. And if White managed to fend off the attack, we do need to be considerate with our weaknesses. Do we face any weaknesses in this position? Is there anything that Black need to take care of here? That's pretty important, by the way. So yes, we talked a lot about general problems, but in chess you have to deal with concrete problems. What are the concrete problems that we're facing? Hello there, Jazz Guy Thomas. So if White would be on move, Black would be in trouble. Let's deal with the situation. The G5 pawn is hanging. So he plays F6. Somebody was asking, can you take here? Well, then I have Rook H1 check, and I would swarm in with my pieces. And that's why Sigulski didn't take on G5. So here, F6. So now we have this big question. Why is F6 okay here and not okay in general? Well, the answer is simple. We no longer have the G7 bishop, so we no longer have to deal with the fact that the bishop is going to be closed in. We don't have that bishop anymore, so it's not a problem. F4. Now, do we want to open it up in front of our kings? No. We're going to play knight F7. Keep it closed. And if F5, we don't mind, then we would get an E5 square forever. And it is something that we're wishing to have. Rook F3. And as you guys mentioned, we still lag in development. So let's try to solve that. We still have pieces underdeveloped, so let's deal with that. So this knight, even though is hiding, it can still take that bishop on g4. So let's be stingy and not give up our bishops for nothing. I mean, not nothing for a check, but the check is not quite enough. So yeah, let's do the conservative bishop d7. Now, if they would be taking stuff, I think we can take back, takes, And this check would be nasty in general, but I have this knight e5 move, and because it's protected by the pawn, white would be in big trouble. Because eventually, after some exchanges, I would have just too much pressure. But this didn't happen. Cygulski is going for the slow grind, trying to put this bishop already, aiming at our kings. Rook g8, which is a fantastic move. Bishop b2 and Shuba to play and get the attack. So the question is, why the heck did Shuba play Rook g8? What was the idea behind Rook g8? Is Rook g8 a usual move? Is that normal? Can we call that a normal move? Don't forget, our opponent still has threats now. F takes g5 is a threat, and then this pawn would be lost. And custom mods has the great point. But the wrong move. It's not the right move. That's why, as Paragon says, among many others, GF is the move. If you go immediately, I can take, and I will be able to take on f6, and black is the one who's losing. Takes, and then, even if you capture back, I will take on f6. So GF is the great move, GF and king f8. And suddenly, the hunted is the hunter. And suddenly knight h4 is in the air. And this time, it's white who's overloaded. So the GF, king f8, and his rook g8 is a brilliant, brilliant maneuver by Shuba. And suddenly, it all collapses for Cygulski. f5. But f5 was not good enough. Black to move and win. So I see rook takes h2. I see knight f4, knight h4. Many, many ideas. Question is, can the white king hide? That is the big question. Also, we have to decide what is the big target. So obviously, the solution should be along these lines. And indeed, the big move is knight f4. Why is knight f4 the best move here? Well, for the following reasons. If you take here, takes, you check, I can go king h1, and you can't mate me yet. And sadly, knight f3 doesn't work because there's rook takes h1. In fact, even that is good. And funnily, even this is winning for black because I have knight d1 check, which is fantastic. This is fantastic. Even this works. But the simplest solution is rook knight f4. Point being that this knight is no longer defended because it's pinned. So I can take on h2 after rook takes f4. The rook takes f4. Let's try to find the mate over here. Yanni Dormali, thank you for the follow. Rook g2 check. Yes, king takes g2. And you're very close. Takes. Let's calculate a little bit more. Rook takes h2. I'm trying to run away with my king. And there is this final touch. Takes here. And queen h3. And you can't avoid king e1, queen g3, where you lose the rook and the game. A very nice performance by Shuba. So this was the game that I wanted to show. Thank you for following Flipper Squad. And this is all that I wanted to show you guys tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I showed you some Fischer classics, a new Fischer concept, which made so much. And in fact, this was the Shuba game really playing to the Benoni style. And if you do want to see more of these lectures and want to play in the future, feel free to join us. Thank you for the follow, Fisher Rock. And with that, I shall be signing off. And I thank you so much for you guys being around. We might do some tournaments in the upcoming future, most definitely. Take care, guys, and hope that you guys will have a good day or night wherever you are. Cheers.